Hello, welcome to Nintendo Deep Dive. I am your host, Carl, and this is episode 3. To those listening, I hope all is well and worthy, and I hope you enjoy the show. So for those who are initiated with Nintendo Deep Dive already, I imagine you are expecting the show to carry out in a predictable order. However, for episode 3, we will be going in an exact reverse of that order. So I'm going to start by reviewing Bomberman Hero for the Nintendo 64. And then I'm going to move on to the Game Boy and review WarioLand 3. And then I'm going to cap off the show with a what I've been playing section of sorts. So that will be the order of events for episode 3. However, before we delve into all of that, just a thought for the day, a share time from me. The thing I was musing about for the past little bit is the two camps in the gaming world. Well, there's more than two camps in the gaming world. There's hundreds, but confined to what I'm talking about, there is two. And that is the people who love modern gaming, and then the other camp is the people who are more into retro gaming. I, like a number of other people, wouldn't be classified as either. Though, at the end of the day, I probably am more interested in the legacy of Nintendo than I am its future. Even so, though, I'm not a retro gamer, nor am I somebody who gets excited about modern improvements and implementations, whether that be 4K graphics, controller options, or quality of life improvements. In terms of what I'm looking for when I play a game, I am looking for very obvious effort, to put it simply. When I play a game, I want to feel that there was heart and work put into it. And when there's heart and work put into something, real effort, regardless of what that system is on, that game is going to impress me. That game is going to capture my attention, and it's going to live on in my imagination. And both modern games and retro games can do that. But I find a lot of people, they're more interested in almost a very black and white, not even that they're interested in a black and white approach. It's just that they seem to be very partial to one or the other as far as modern versus retro gaming goes. For the people who are retro gamers, I find that a lot of their love for these games almost comes out of memory and nostalgia, which this is not news to anybody. But for me, that's just not the case. I typically find that a lot of the reasons people like old games is because of it was their first experience, or it was the first in the industry to implement this innovation. So a lot of it's centered around novelty, which I find novelty to have a very short shelf life. I think about Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. That game introduced adhesive surfaces that you could climb on everywhere throughout the game. And everybody lost their minds about that. And I thought it was cool, certainly. But with Tears of the Kingdom coming out, the sequel, nobody's really going to care about that. They'd care if it wasn't in there, but they're not going to be wowed by its continued inclusion unless they actually do something with it that is interesting on a gameplay level. But I would dare say that a lot of people, if it wasn't in the game, I think they'd get over it pretty quickly. But for a lot of people who, let's say they're 10 years old and they played Breath of the Wild, when that game becomes retro, that's always going to be a thing that they're citing about the game. Oh, it was the game where you could climb anywhere, and the feelings they got from being able to do that. But for me, eventually you just kind of see the limitations of certain innovations, and they become normalized. And so they, in and of themselves, don't really matter. As for modern gamers, they want everything to operate smoothly. A lot of modern gamers do anyway. They want the least amount of friction possible. So it's a lot of quality of life innovations, for lack of a better word. And when it comes to making new games in a series or reintroducing older titles that already exist, so much of it is about new modern options, 1080p graphics, or dual stick controls, like in the case of the new Metroid Prime game. For me, I find a lot of these modern QOL implementations to they're akin to a steamroller flattening everything, making a level surface, a smooth surface. But in doing so, they remove some really key topographical details, idiosyncrasies of a game that really make that game interesting. And even if they don't do that, I don't think QOLs are that important. As somebody who isn't very good at games, I guess, I've gotten used to just putting in a little bit of extra effort to adjust to challenges or new controls that come with every new game that I'm playing. So the fact that some people, for them, that they couldn't get into a game like Metroid Prime because it didn't have dual stick controls, even though the old control setup that it had was perfectly functional, I find that extremely petty, that they couldn't overcome some low hurdles to play, to put it modestly, one of the 20 best games ever made. That they didn't find it worth it to overcome that. That's not really somebody whose opinion I really want to take in for very long. At the same time, I don't want to give too much credence to someone who bases all of their opinions and observations on childhood memories and distant emotional reactions they had years and years ago that they just have enshrined, and they don't want to revisit those experiences on an intellectual level to reevaluate and reappraise them. So I'm in neither camp when it comes to these two camps that I may have artificially created. But for myself, my enjoyment of games comes down to how solid their core design is, whether it be innovative or iterative. I don't really care about the initial accessibility of a game, nor do I nor am I wistful about innovations of the time. So that's just a little about myself. Moving on from that, we are going to go into our first review. The subject of that review, Bomberman Hero. Bomberman Hero. Released in August of 1998, at least in America. Directed by Hudson Soft's own Naohiro Matsumoto. Main designer Shoji Mitsuno. And doing the music was Jun Chikuma, who was the main composer for the Bomberman series up to this point and continuing forward. Typically, I review games in order of playthrough, but I'm pulling this one out of the queue into the front for the sake of a quick review. It's going to be a quick review because there's not too much to say about Bomberman Hero, good or bad. Bomberman Hero is a isometric / 3/4 view platformer. It's not technically 3/4 in the strict sense of that moniker, but games like this, games like Super Mario 3D World, they've been referred to as 3/4. But anyway, it's a isometric platformer with 3D graphics. The player character Bomberman has a basic jump and also the typical Bomberman powers, or I assume they're typical. You have a throw that you can do while you're jumping or standing. You can set your bombs down and kick them, or you can just set them and leave them, of course. Levels are very linear with a beginning and end, but also plenty of collectible gems to grab along the way. The game features a story, but I couldn't deal with it. I didn't even give it a chance, I'm going to be honest. It just seemed generic and for kids. I think about Shigeru Miyamoto and his strong aversion to stories in certain games, and while in certain key cases he hasn't been entirely correct, when I think about Bomberman Hero, this would be one of those games where he is correct. There's no need to have a story here. At the same time, though, I could just skip all the cutscenes. Even so, though, there is like this element of I'm missing possible key information that is baked into the game. I highly doubt it mattered, but I skipped the story. It just seemed like a pointless inclusion. Not super offensive, just, no, I didn't want to deal with it. As for the gameplay, I believe there's 5 worlds, maybe 6 with a hidden world. Each of them have different regions, and each different region has about 5 or 6 levels. So levels are plentiful, but very short. In addition to the platforming stages, there are also on-rail sections, on-rail shmup sections, and they are intended to punctuate the experience, is my guess. If you are one of those people that remembers the game fondly, all the power to you. There's little that the game does wrong, though it doesn't do much right either. This is not on the level of a Mario platformer. It's too basic. Most of it is just throwing a bomb to kill an enemy or blow up something destructible in front of you, or perhaps either hitting or planting a bomb by a switch and then booking it over to a platform that will lift off once that switch is hit by the explosion. Things like that. I can't really remember anything that was terribly elaborate. As I said, this isn't a Mario platformer where there's a 4-step design to each level. As an example, in Mario 3D World, there's the level with the flip switches where they operate on a hinge, and every time you jump, they'll swing on the hinge to the other side, like a swinging door. So when you jump, it will go to the red side. Jump again, it will go to the blue side. And it's introduced, in a safe space. Then it's introduced in a place where there's actually potential to die. And then they introduce a second obstacle, such as the pulse lasers that send out a laser pulse that moves in 360 degrees and doesn't seem to fade out with distance. It just keeps heading towards you. So yeah, it's a simple thing to jump over that laser pulse. But then they combine the two where when you jump, you're not only is it a matter of jumping, it's being forced to jump by the obstacle. And so now there's a timing aspect to it. And they add other obstacles on top of that single idea. And if you're playing it with other people, now you have to synchronize your jumps, because if you're jumping out of order, soon most of you or all of you will be dead in short order. And then there's also the aspect of the double cherry power-up where you are herding together a bunch of clones, trying to keep them alive and bunched together so you don't lose one of the clones as you make these hasty jumps. Just lots of things going on in what could be a 90-second run through of a otherwise straightforward level. And like Super Mario 3D World, Bomberman Hero does introduce certain gimmicks into some of its levels, but they are very one note, never being extrapolated on, or not really extrapolated on. One of the more memorable ones to me is the level where there is a mirror, and the camera is situated like a 2D platformer from the side, as you'd imagine, and everything you're doing is being reflected by the mirror. And they do a couple things with this level. They use the mirror to convey information that is not readily available to you within the player field. And then they also do a thing where it turns out that the nature of the mirror image isn't actually quite what you'd think it would be. That's the most interesting level in the game, but even that one, it's not like they took it as far as a Mario game would take it. All the other levels, I can't really go into detail about them, as I forget most of it on account of them being forgettable. And moreover, I'd be boring myself and you listeners if I tried recollecting these mundane details. Overall, the standard levels are inoffensive but severely undercooked. Same with the visuals in these levels. They are very baseline N64 graphics. Nice colors, but very lacking textures. So, not bad, not good, just nothing. As for audio, the best thing about Bomberman Hero is that one song played in the bonus stages and in the first level of the game. I'm sure there's other good songs that I've overlooked, probably because my ears were busy with podcasts, because that's how I was redeeming the time. The last thing I want to bring up, the on-rail levels that were intended to break up the monotony instead merely add to it. There's lots of them, like 12 or 15. And while there's 4 different kinds of them technically, the different kinds, their differences are surface level. It's all pretty much the same, whether you're the helicopter, the submarine, the rocket pack, or the bobsled. Some differences, but they're all the same thing, and the design in them is it's just a basic shmup. Enemies are coming at you, and you can shoot them, or you could very readily avoid them. There's one pesky level where stuff falls on your head, and that seems super weird in that it seems to gravitate towards you, but I made it through that level just fine. It wasn't really a big deal. Either way, though, those parts of the game, not exciting either. Anywho, the fact is that it's not a game to get breathless over. One thing I'll mention, but not delve into, with this game is my immediate disagreement upon seeing a pile of collectibles strewn across a level. Though this clutter is optional, I see it as developer presumption on a player's engagement, especially when it's early on in the game. And what I mean by developer presumption is that it's like the developer thinks you're already hooked on the game, and so they're giving you more fodder to interact with, just to give you more stuff to do. And this is a very specific issue that I have. I just don't like seeing a bunch of stuff that I immediately say, I'm going to walk around that. And for other people, maybe they just see collectibles and they want to get them. But for me, I'm more tantalized by ledges that are out of reach, or paths that wrap around the side of a cliff out of my view. Things that just make me curious about, what's beyond my immediate vision, not what's in my immediate vision, like what's cluttering up my immediate vision. So apparently there's some unlockables with these gems if you collect them all and kill all the enemies, which those unlockables don't sound that appealing anyway. But it's good to have collectibles in games, but they have to be valuable by rarity rather than just this low-hanging fruit implementation. That makes me want to walk around things. That makes me want to hug the most linear path possible, because I just don't want to engage with that. Anyway, not to delve into it. Overall, the game is if reviewing it, the game is a 5.5 out of 10. It's better than it's worse, hence that score, tipping it more in favor of good than bad ever so slightly, especially with that great music. I never beat the game, but I got to the final world, and the final world was comprised of bosses I had already beaten, though to the game's benefit, the bosses were put in arenas which changed the context of your fight against them quite significantly. Even so, I just didn't have the energy to go through that to fight the final boss. At that point, I had seen 90% of the content and wasn't impressed with it. So the game's a 5.5 out of 10. As for where I'd rank it, to start from the bottom, it's better than Banjo-Tooie, though I feel like there's something sacrilegious about saying that. Banjo-Tooie is obviously a much more high production game with more to engage you, but Bomberman Hero doesn't actively annoy me like Banjo-Tooie does. So with that going for it, Bomberman Hero is a better game than Banjo-Tooie. Is it a better game than 007 The World Is Not Enough? I would say it isn't. Visually speaking, I think the games are almost comparable. Maybe with Bomberman Hero getting the edge, especially with the better music, but with The World Is Not Enough, because you have the multiplayer that you could potentially have quite a bit of fun with, even if it's just another one of those kinds of multiplayers. It gives The World Is Not Enough a greater longevity over Bomberman Hero. So Bomberman Hero is better than Banjo-Tooie, worse than 007 The World Is Not Enough. So with that said, to quickly go through the list, at number 1 we have Ocarina of Time, at number 2 we have Banjo-Kazooie, at number 3 we have Diddy Kong Racing, at number 4 Star Fox 64, at number 5 Rogue Squadron, at number 6 Wave Race 64, at number 7 Smash Bros 64, and number 8 Star Wars Episode 1 Racer, at number 9 Doom 64, at number 10 Turok 2, at number 11 Sin and Punishment, at number 12 GoldenEye, at number 13 Battle for Naboo, at number 14 Beetle Adventure Racing, at number 15 Extreme G, at number 16 Perfect Dark, at number 17 Shadows of the Empire, at number 18 Yoshi's Story, at number 19 Jet Force Gemini, at number 20 DK64, at number 21 Super Mario Party 2, at number 22 Turok, at number 23 007 The World Is Not Enough, at number 24 Bomberman Hero, and at 25 taking up the rear guard, Banjo-Tooie. So we'll take a small breather, and when we return we will talk about WarioLand 3. Okay, welcome back. We are going to talk about WarioLand 3 now. WarioLand 3, released on May 30th in the year 2000, developed by Takahiko Tosakawa, with music done by Kozui Ishikawa, and main design done by Hiroji Kiyotake. None of those names they don't stand out to me, but those are some of the developers of this game. But getting into the game itself, much like Bomberman Hero, there's not much to say. Well, actually, there's a bit to say. Mostly in that we have one of the few examples where N64 design philosophy bleeds into Game Boy software. More on that later. The third WarioLand game continues the shake-up trend of the series, being considerably different from 1 and 2, though with core tenets from 2 continuing. The interesting thing about WarioLand 3 is that it is a 2D rendition of Mario 64 with Metroid-esque gating to boot. The levels in the game are big, but broken up into different objectives in the form of treasure chests. The level ends, or the player is booted out rather, when they open a treasure chest with a key of matching color that is found elsewhere in that level. Unlike Mario 64, however, where you would just jump back into the level onto the next objective, in Wario Land 3, the subsequent chest is unobtainable, forcing the player to move on to the first chest of the next level, and then the first of the third level, until eventually, either through some event or added move, Wario is cued to trek backwards into the previous levels, which are conveniently earmarked by a sparkling of their level node on the world map screen. Obtain the next set of treasure chests in the newly opened areas, and a new level will conveniently appear on the map. And the game will continue to progress in this one step forward, two steps back manner. As for the gameplay, Wario controls in the same manner as he did in 2. However, his litany of moves is conspicuously absent, at least at the start of the game, only coming back to you one at a time in the tried and true Metroid fashion. The status effects are back from 2, as is Wario's invincibility, thus continuing its predecessor's design of you avoid or utilize the game's enemies and obstacles. It remains as vexing as ever, as I see it. There are some differences still, such as the de-emphasization of loot that was present in Wario Land 2. In that game, you were just collecting hundreds of coins per level. In this game, I'm pretty certain there's coins, but it's really just about these core objectives mostly. To start with the good things about the game, the status effects remain ridiculous as ever. Tumbling as a ball down a hill to bowl through blocks in a low clearance tunnel remains the highlight of these games. The structure of this game makes it more digestible than Wario Land 2, which is especially convenient if you are reviewing these games. Those things aside, though, there's not much else to say, unfortunately. Everything else that comes to mind is either middling or negative. To start with middling, for a series with such a lively anti-hero, who was introduced in one of the most creative Mario outings ever, it is such a shame that outside of the status effects, this series, particularly this game, has failed to create a compelling aesthetic or atmosphere. Wario either visits grasslands or urban environments such as apartment complexes, cable suspension bridges, and nighttime cities, things of that sort. No environment comes off as interesting. Granted, I didn't see all of them. I never beat the game. I got about halfway through in 6 hours' time, and with how it was progressing, I just didn't want to play it, and it seemed like what I had seen up until that point was what would be in the rest of the game. Usually I like to get a little farther in games, but I didn't feel like it. In addition to an uninteresting aesthetic, the level design is also very uninteresting, with objectives being fairly one note, and obstacle design being equally so, and the structure of the levels also being kind of just that way. They're big, and someone might find that impressive, but I am not that someone. An example of a mundane level in this game is the cable suspension bridge, where On the first level, it's just a bridge with no platforming other than jumping over enemies that if they hit you, they will cause you to turn into a bowling ball, loosely speaking, and then you'll roll all the way back to the beginning of the level. And so once you're on your feet again, you just have to retry crossing the bridge without getting hit by these fish. And the fish are situated in such a way that you don't have a lot of time to react. So you're kind of doing it just off of learned. I don't know how to say it. Most of the game's platforming plays out like that, where there's really not much going on aside from an enemy that is wasting your time, forcing you to restart until you jump over them. How you deal with those enemies is usually pretty basic at the end of it, but this is the design of the game, the core design of it, to have your time wasted. That's the penalty system in the game. The game is at its best when you're utilizing the status effects, not being plagued by them. Really, the design is about Kirby level caliber. Not that it's specifically like Kirby design, but it's hard to describe something that's just simply absent. There's not really too much going on as far as active design within the levels, which, in my humble opinion, platformers require. Lots of active, in your face design with very minimal lulls. One of the most prominent examples of boring game and objective design in WarioLand 3 is this mini golf game where you, using meters like you would in a typical golf game, you charge into a ball or creature of some kind, pardon me, to sink it into the hole. You do this about 8 to 12 times, if I had to guess, throughout the duration of the game, because I did it at least 4 times in the first half. It's not the worst thing in the world. It's just really boring and simple, and I believe you have to pay money to play it. So if you fail it enough times, you run out of money, then you have to grind for money to play this mini golf game. And when you succeed in this golf mini game, a little block raises up, granting you access to the objective. It's not a very good mini game, and it pops up, as I said, 8 to a dozen times. Continuing on with the negatives, the decision to waste my time rather than kill me had me begging for death, particularly with the bosses where, again, you can't die, so the penalty is they do something to you that throws you up through a floor that you can phase through from below, but you can't downward phase through it. And then you have to leave through the available door and then circle back around to start the boss fight from scratch. There's one boss fight in this game. It's a iteration of the basketball game with the bunny in WarioLand 2, where each opponent would try to score a goal with the other opponent. This time it's with a soccer net. And the way it goes is the rabbit, which you're going up against, if he turns you into a ball and throws you at the net, there's a goalie, and that goalie he'll turtle up because he is a turtle to give the rabbit an open target. When you go to score with the rabbit, he actually, is a goalie and is trying to stop you. And there's a low clearance ceiling that makes it really hard for you to hold an object above your head, which is kind of common in this game, that you hold objects above your head to throw them, but they're very easily dislodged from your hand, particularly by low clearance ceilings. So I would say the game feels pretty good to play, except for the fact that throwing in the game feels like garbage. And this boss fight is garbage. I eventually started save scumming it because I knew I could beat it, but it took me like 40 minutes to score 3 goals, and it's just an intentionally vexing boss fight. And lots of things in this game are just time wasting. And I don't love that. Additionally, the Metroid lock and key design is very uninspired. The game doesn't gain anything by doing it, other than allowing a variety in which level you go to, I suppose. But the Mario 64 structure does make the game more digestible, if anything. Also, the game's not graphically impressive, as I alluded to before. Audio wise, there's nothing that really stuck out to me either. So, my conclusion with this game is that there is a great gap in quality between it and the Shake Dimension, better known as Shake It in the United States, with only one game between them to bridge that gap. And I am interested to see how well WarioLand 4 will bridge that gap between WarioLand 3 and WarioLand Shake It. All that said, games, I'm going to give it a 5.5 out of 10 because I didn't see all of it. And so I'm going to give it some benefit of the doubt. Had I played all of it, I'd probably give it a 5 out of 10. It feels so long, though, and I just couldn't be bothered to beat it. It feels longer than it is. And aside from some interesting wrinkles, the few positives double as negatives in an otherwise uneventful and unimaginative adventure. As for where it ranks among the other Game Boy titles, starting from the bottom, it's better than Shantae because it's a whole number grade above it. And is it better than WarioLand 2? I would say I actually enjoyed it more than WarioLand 2, but WarioLand 2 is a better game, even if I didn't enjoy it that much. So that's where WarioLand 3 will stay. So to go over the list, at number 1 we have Pokemon Blue, and number 2 we have Pokemon Puzzle Challenge, and number 3 Game & Watch Gallery, and number 4 Game & Watch Gallery 2, and number 5 Game & Watch Gallery 3, and number 6 Mole-Mania, and number 7 DK Land 2, and number 8 Mega Man Extreme 2, and number 9 WarioLand 2, and number 10 WarioLand 3, and taking up the rear guard, at number 11 we have Shantae. So, let's go to music break. And when we come back, we will delve into our final segment, which might be a long one. So, brace yourselves. So, welcome back to the final segment of episode 3. And that is what I've been playing. Rather, what have I been buying? And what I bought was a Nintendo Switch. I bought it on account of the release of Metroid Prime Remastered. Interestingly enough, my last hurried purchase of a Nintendo console was also on account of a high-profile GameCube remaster. I imagine that says something about me. As for Metroid Prime Remaster, it's a great remaster with enough new effort, keyword effort, put into it that I'd consider it an original product and not just sloppy seconds from a better console. Moreover, I'm also certain, to the 93rd percentile, that this will be the best that the Switch has to offer. I've played the game 3 times and it sounds like it's the exact same game, and on the Wii and on the GameCube, it was an incredible game, so having graphics that make it look better while also not ruining the aesthetic. Yeah, I have no doubt. Well, I have 7% doubt. So, what are my impressions of this game that I was so ecstatic about that I bought a Switch for it? Don't have any. Haven't played it. Let my older brother have the system for a while because I knew he'd enjoy the remaster. Instead of playing Metroid, I put together the Labo vehicle toy cons with my nephews and niece. Do I have impressions of that? Not really, aside from the building part, because I left my Labo creations with my nephews and niece to reclaim at a later date, should they survive. As for the building part, I had a lot of fun with that, and I played it for maybe 20 minutes, and it seemed like the software part of the game was certainly better than the initial Labo releases. Definitely, not a full-fledged experience. Not one that you should have high expectations about anyway. But the building part was great. The act of putting tabs into these slits in the cardboard, one after the other, and as it's coming together, it's becoming more structurally sound. Whatever it is that you're making, and as you slide that last tab in place, all of a sudden the thing that you're making becomes rigid and sturdy, and it's not going to break on you immediately. That's a very satisfying feeling. I heard people say that they found the building part of Labos terribly fatiguing. I did it across 2 separate days, and I had a great time with it. I never got bored with it. And it's quite sad, though, that my nephew with a broken arm was folding and putting it together better than I was. But with certain things, with the Labo sets, there was enough folds that you could be taking one side while the other person could take the other, and you would be getting the folding out of the way. The instructions on Labo are, I don't want to say brilliant, but they're super fleshed out and have lots of great features and lots of writing that really resonates with children in an interesting way, like how children see shapes of objects and animals in the cardboard, and at certain times the instructions would be making those comparisons, and then at other times it would be the children making those comparisons without prompting. That was interesting. So it was written on their level, and you can also spin the 3D object on the television around with the Joy-Con controller to get every angle if you're unsure of something. Structurally speaking and creatively speaking, the concept of Labo is super cool. And it makes it worth it just for that, even though the cardboard's going to fall apart and there's no longevity with it. And there's not even longevity without the cardboard being inevitably destroyed, because the games are, they're more playthings than substantial softwares. I'd like to play more of it, but I don't have it, is my point. I got a Switch, and I'd bought the Labo previously, finally got to put it together, and now I don't have any of those items I purchased. This kind of deference I also practiced with the Switch when I first bought it back in 2017. I bought ARMS for a whole $80 because that's how much things cost in Canada, which is terrible. And then I decided to play on my Wii U while the Switch stayed in the box and ARMS stayed in the case. I eventually sold that particular machine to a person at church for a low price after it sat dormant for a year and a half. And that was back in winter 2020. And now, 3 years later, I have purchased the Switch once more, though continue to practice my pattern of deference and indifference. But now I think only for a brief while, probably. So, from that little bit of anecdotery, It's plain to see that the Switch is not topping my list of Nintendo machines, though it has accrued enough games in the past 6 years to be considered a well enough investment. Even so, I have a lot of gripes with Nintendo's second most popular machine. In episode 21 of the podcast, the one titled Excitebots, I cited one of those major issues, that being the underwhelming number of software being released, with major development companies under-delivering. Of course, that has now been slightly remedied, particularly in the case of HAL Laboratory, since they put out their first 3D Kirby game ever, and they did it in style, so that they took 3 years, or not 3 years, 4 years on that. That's perfectly acceptable. But considering the fact that the Switch inherited both console and handheld markets, I'm far from impressed with the release quantity. However, I'm less impressed still by the quality of releases, and less so with the hardware quality. To start with the quality of the hardware, while I appreciate the multimodal, multifunctional nature of the Switch, it seems at best a jack of all trades, and at worst, a jackass. Let's face it, despite Nintendo's definitions, the Switch is a Game Boy packed with a SNES that has a Super Game Boy permanently welded onto the cartridge slot. It's in line with the current progression of that lineage, but as a console, it's a failure to move forward, just like the Wii was, at least as power goes. Then there's the packed-in controller, known as Joy-Cons. Probably the worst first-party controller since the N64, featuring shallow sticks with large dead zones, the right one improperly placed directly below the buttons rather than below and off to the left, making it so that rather than extending your thumb, you're actually doing what's like an inchworm position with your thumb, which is super uncomfortable as far as ergonomics go. Additionally, the Joy-Cons are too small on their own to hold comfortably. There's the infamous Joy-Con drift. I've had plenty of my own experiences with hardware malfunctions with this Switch. Twice it was the Joy-Con drift. Another time it was the housing around the Joy-Con breaking apart. And yes, a child was using it, so children are pretty aggressive with hardware, but this was like the third time it was used by them. So for a company that caters to children, still unacceptable. And so I had to send in these Joy-Cons twice, and because they're $100 in Canada and $80 in the US, in both places they're way overpriced for silly things like HD Rumble and an IR camera, though the IR camera is super cool in Labo, I guess. For all these things, I wasn't going to get a second pair of Joy-Cons. So, like most people, you'd probably buy a cheap third-party controller, or in my case, I was just playing on the 3DS and the Wii U. I also had an experience where the AC adapter on the Switch failed on me. And whereas the AC adapters for the 3DS were $10, $15 in Canada, they wanted $40 for the Switch one. And apparently $40 was a bridge too far, especially since there was nothing I wanted to play on the Switch at that time. And so it sat for a year and a half. I just didn't want to pay the $40 because I didn't want to spend $40 on what was seemingly a simple component, and also almost out of spite. The peripherals in general for the Switch were way too expensive. The Switch came out at $300, but it didn't have a pack-in game, so $300 it's well enough, but you're not getting anything with it. And they wanted $70 for a Pro controller, whereas the competitors, they only wanted $50 to $60 for controllers that were basically of equal quality. But Nintendo wanted $70 for HD Rumble and motion sensing gyroscopes I guess. And maybe an NFC reader, which I don't know. The controller was too expensive. And in Canada, for whatever reason, stuff in the Wii U days and the 3DS days was maybe $10 more or $5 more. And then all of a sudden, it was just a flat $20 tax. Same with Australia. Not a good day for the Commonwealth in this small matter. But these peripherals, such as the dock was like $80 to $100. And I don't even know what the dock is. I don't think anybody knows what the dock is. But for a plastic toaster, why would a replacement dock or a secondary dock for a different part of the house be $100? And of course, yeah, as I said, the Joy-Cons here, they'd be $100, which they're such a crappy controller. Why would you ever want to buy one of them or a pair of them? And yes, they can double up as two separate controllers for little kids, but it's not. It's one of the worst ways to play any game with those Joy-Con sideways. Playing the Wii remote sideways wasn't my favorite thing, but it's way better than doing it with the Joy-Cons. And the one thing with the Joy-Con drift, they made 2 iterations of the Switch, and with none of those iterations did they fix it. Apparently, on the manufacturing part, it seems to have gone away a little more, but it's still brought up, and it was an issue for like 6 years. And even if you were getting it done for free within like a year purchase, in my case at the time, no, in my case, I actually had to pay. Never mind, I'm lying. I had to pay for my fix. Anyway, you'd be left without controllers, and it's just something that they didn't handle well at all, and I just hate the sticks on that Switch. I'm not sure this would be a better solution for certain games, but the circle pad on the 3DS feels way better to use. It's probably limited in like movement because of its stick depth, but I really like that circle pad on the 3DS. The sticks on the Switch, on the Joy-Cons, you play with those, feels like you're going to snap them off. And one thing that we shouldn't forget is that with all these games and all these peripherals, there's no cheaper second tier pricing on a cheaper handheld. There's no $40 to $50 games that you could buy like it was in the past. That was one of the things about the handheld market, is that it was more affordable to buy games for that. And those games weren't slouches in quality either. They were just smaller experiences with older gen graphics. And also keep in mind that the Switch is essentially, as I said, an expected progression of handheld technology as far as Nintendo handhelds go. The fact that you're paying console prices for games that are 2 generations behind, that with everything else I've mentioned, I think just all of that made me wary of the Switch software. And so I think I became a harder sell with it. I was more critical because I had to spend more money. So I wasn't in a forgiving mood. But I think it also has something to do with feeling, what's the word? Bicked. Yeah, feeling bicked with the purchase of ARMS and Splatoon 2. With ARMS, no, ARMS does not have legs. The more content they released for the game, the more you realize that every character essentially was interchangeable. Especially since you could just mix and match their glove attachments. So the only thing that was really different with the characters was some speed variations and one little move that they could do. It wasn't a terrible game. It's a fun party game in a local co-op setting, but that game wasn't worth $80. Kind of feel like a moron for buying it. And then Splatoon 2, often given the pejorative Splatoon 1.5, and for good reason, just felt like Splatoon 1. There was certain things that were better about it. There were certain things that was worse. But overall, it felt like the experience that I had with it, I could have readily had with Splatoon 1 on the game, not the GameCube, but the Wii U. So that was a silly purchase, even if there was more content than ARMS. It's also, remember that with ARMS, this is the only game, full-on game, that the Mario Kart team has developed. And since then, the only thing they've done is, I guess, Mario Kart Tour, which I don't know. I don't want to be too flippant, but who cares about that? And then there's the Boost Pass, which is cool, but in some cases with those tracks, you're getting what you pay for because they vary in quality. But otherwise, all they've done is ARMS back in 2017. Those two games aside, I think the positive response to the Switch software, despite a lot of middling titles, makes me feel like I'm taking crazy pills. Because, my goodness, are Switch games corner cutters? And even when they're not, Nintendo's new gaming philosophy has turned a lot of their big titles into baby games, such as Mario Odyssey, which I talked about a few episodes ago. But getting into the software, before we go into the bad, let's talk about the good to try to be fair. First good thing, Metroid has been well represented on the Switch. You could probably also include the 2017 release of Metroid Samus Returns in that, as part of that. You could lump it in because it came out in the time frame of the Switch lifetime, I suppose. So you have that game, and then you have Metroid Dread, which Metroid Dread, I swear that game doesn't look as good as people say it does. I think it looks good at a distance, but for a game that wants to pan the camera in as often as it does, they should have made more detailed models. Or, if they needed models to pop and be more simple in color and texture. I don't know. Maybe it was worth it, but that's a weird decision to have stuff that looks okay in the distance all of a sudden be zoomed in up on. I don't own the game yet, but this is just from footage I've seen. Apparently it's the best 2D Metroid for a lot of people. I'm suspicious of that claim, but it certainly looks good. And then there's Metroid Prime Remaster on the Switch, which, as I said, counts as a new game because of the effort they put into it. And I'm pretty sure it will be the best game on the Switch. And then there's the eventual Metroid Prime 4, which they've taken way too long to develop. Whatever it is, it's not going to be impressive enough for that given amount of development time. But either way, Metroid has been doing well on the Switch. If you're a Xenoblade fan, I'd get it if the Switch was your favorite console ever, because there's 3 Xenoblade games, a remake and 2 original games. For myself, the only one I truly enjoyed was Xenoblade Chronicles X, though I did play the first one and didn't hate it, but I like Xenoblade Chronicles X. Everyone else, like Xenoblade Chronicles, a lot of representation, a lot of quality games. Mario Party, I don't know about the representation of Mario Party. It's been okay, I guess, because of the one Mario Party that was good in quotations, because I don't think any Mario Party is truly actually good, strictly speaking. And if you're about indies, the Switch is good because it's got a lot of them. I think indies are a cut below AAA games, so I don't get too excited about them, aside from every 50th indie that's really great. So, I'll give them their due, but anyway, the Switch is good because of indies, and if you're going to play indies, playing it portably is pretty good. That being said, a lot of indie games cost like $25 in Canada, which is too much for what those are. But we're not complaining here. Only good things. Kirby Star Allies was a pretty so-so game, but they took 4 years and they came out with Kirby and the Forgotten Lands, which, again, I'm suspicious of its accolades. I'm assuming it's a good game, but it's a Kirby game, meaning that all of its potential is undercut by the fact that it's a game that doesn't want to give the player any kind of challenge whatsoever, which it's a game for kids, but kids will overcome challenge and it will benefit them in the long run. So that philosophy really doesn't justify the wasted potential of Kirby games, and I'm assuming that this will continue on into this game, but a lot of love put into the game all the same. Is it the best Kirby game? I don't know. Apparently it's the best selling one. Zelda with Breath of the Wild and a second Zelda game coming and a remake of Link's Awakening. I suppose Zelda's doing pretty good, but I'll get into it in a little bit. I think I've already gotten into it in episode 21, but it could be doing much better. And then Square Enix. Square Enix did some development on the 3DS, but not too much compared to the DS. But Square Enix, while all their games are of that certain ilk for the most part, HD 2D, it's a cool look, and it's a great way to circumvent the Switch's middling, not even middling, low graphical power. That specific art style is a good thing. So Square Enix has been doing really solid work on Nintendo Switch. Everything else, some or lots of issues. To start with the MIA series, there's no Donkey Kong Country on the Switch aside from a port, which I don't care about ports. Funky Motor, no. There's no Mario Kart, no actual title. And I understand why there isn't, because they haven't even reached the saturation point of Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. So they just be cannibalizing sales. But that does tell you that, yes, sometimes ports do replace new games, despite the fact that people say they don't. But they do. There's no F-Zero, there's no Star Fox. It took them 6 years to get a Pikmin out, but we are getting one. The third-party support of the Switch has been pretty lame, despite what people say. Capcom put out an exclusive game for it in 2021. They ported over some 3DS games that were Japan release only, so let's pretend that they're new, I guess. I'll give them that. But it took them 4 years to show any support for the Switch. And then there's the matter of a lot of cloud gaming on the Switch, which is no good. But maybe I'm just being hoity-toity. I just don't think that's a great way to put games on the Switch. But it also tells you that it's apparently the only way you can get these games on the Switch. There have been some high-profile ports from games released 5 years ago, or 5 years ago at the time, like Witcher 3 and Wolfenstein 2, which isn't even a good game anyway, and the Doom games. And how I feel about that is in line with what I said to my brother as we were looking through the eShop, the brother who I lent the Switch to. I said to him, keep in mind, this is the worst way you can play any of these games, which he had to laugh at because, you know, it's pretty clear. It's pretty clear that this is the case. Like, you can play them portably, but I think playing portably is really uncomfortable anyway, especially for me, stooped over a machine, so you need to play at a table anyway, so you need to be well situated, so you might as well be playing on a television. Bigger screen, it's more comfortable. In a pinch, it's convenient to play portably, but these games don't look good on the Switch, is my point. So the third party on the Switch, Indie's support has been great. Square Enix support's been great. Apparently Factor 5, or Level 5, pardon me, is finally coming back with Professor Layton. They were just MIA for 6 years on the Switch. And I'm sure there's other third-party support still that I haven't mentioned. So yeah, there was no Ace Attorneys for the Switch. No true Ace Attorney sequels aside from The Great Ace Attorney. There's no Call of Duties coming, though apparently they are coming now. Not that I care about Call of Duty, but I'm just saying, like, a lot of these big third-party games, Assassin's Creed, that's not coming to the Switch. You get some old games coming from the Xbox 360 era, but nothing terribly new. Nothing from Ubisoft, aside from a couple key exclusives, but compared to the exclusives that they used to put out on these Nintendo consoles, it's nothing to write home about. Third-party support, like, it's crazy to me that people would pretend that it's good because you get some old ports of older games. Not saying it's wrong to get excited about buying these games again or for the first time to play them on the Switch because it's more appealing to you. But I'm just saying that in terms of original content and effort and putting in the work, the Switch, for how popular it is, third-party support is dismal. And before I get into the actual games that came out, because I want to talk about the quality of the games. I already talked about the quantity in episode 21. I probably talked about it again too much here. But the release windows for Switch games, partially because of COVID, but even then that excuse isn't big enough to cover everything. They were awful. Like, if I was into the Switch for the last 3 years, it would have been as bad as when I owned it back in 2018 and 2019. It was $80 to buy a game, and not enough games were coming out. The games that were coming out were just not that good looking for various reasons. I never wanted to buy anything with the Switch. And the Switch was actually the catalyst for this little podcast to start. While I had the Switch in my possession in 2018, it was sitting doing nothing while I was playing the SNES Mini, and I was playing these SNES classic games, and some of them I had played before and some I hadn't, but either way, they were holding up. They were good games. They were games to be excited about. They were games that you wanted to talk about, or I wanted to talk about. And so I just kept buying older and older games and getting into legacy content. Being excited for the Switch in 2019 and 2018 was like a Lord of the Rings fan trying to be excited about the announcement of new Lord of the Rings projects now. Like, why would you be excited? Like, why would you waste time and energy, and why would you get your hopes up about that sort of thing when you could just go back to the well with that original trilogy of Lord of the Rings movies? And that's how I felt for me with the Switch. Why look to the future of Nintendo when the legacy of Nintendo was so much more exciting? Now, I know most people apparently don't feel that way, but I think they're wrong. Anyway, getting to the lackluster software on the Switch. Because of the high price tags of these games, in addition to not having a Switch for the past 3 years, my appraisal of these games is speculative. But it is telling to me that so many of these first-party and third-party games have readily observable shortcomings. To start with, just off the top of my head, Kirby Star Allies. It's not the worst game ever. It's pretty so-so. It's a continuation of that Return to Dreamland formula, which was pretty good, especially in the 3DS games. But when a game of that ilk, rather, goes from $40 to $60, even with HD graphics, that game can't be 7 hours long or 5 hours long and have very little side content. Now, apparently, they bolted on a bunch of new stuff after the fact, so I guess there's egg on my face, but that doesn't make it any better. You play a game when you get it for maybe a week, and then you may return to it later on, but there's no reason to be waiting like a dog at the door for your master to come home for this little drip feed of content, especially when you've had your fill of the game and it's time to move on. The fact that the most ardent fans of these series have the worst experiences to begin with, and it's only those who wait a long time to actually get what might be a better experience, that's a terrible model of business. It's frankly disrespectful to a degree as well. And on that note, you have all the Mario sports games, which range from okay to more okay. But all of those sports games, I don't think any of them... Well, how do I put it? I think these are all the worst versions in each of their respective franchises. There was a game that came out, Mario Sports Superstars on the 3DS, which was not reviewed kindly. And it had 5 sports, and each of those sports only featured the minimum amount of content, just some basic fields or courses and courts and whatnot. But each of those games in that one game was one of 5. So to expect lots of really in-depth content in what is a revolving door of sports games to play, you get bored with one, you go to the next. I think you're just setting yourself up for disappointment. Granted, I'm not saying the game is great, but when these games on the Switch, which are focusing solely on one sport, demonstrate the same kind of Spartan attitude, that's lousy. And if you wait a year, the games get a lot better with a drip feed of content because of this live service model, which someone explained to me how getting a game and then having to wait a year for it to be good enough is better than just having it be good to begin with. There's no upside other than, oh, we'll just take longer to develop. Well, it's like, who cares? It's not going to be a good experience until it's finished anyway, so you might as well release it when it's finished. There's no upside to this model. Anybody who says otherwise is completely insane, or they're just fixated on having like a engaged online community or something, which in most of these Mario Sports titles, I think this was the reverse. People would play for a week, or they'd play for a couple days, they get bored. Especially in the case of Mario Tennis, where you had a pretty lousy story, which was kind of manipulative that they put it in there, and then the online was whack. It didn't get much better till much later. I would think Mario Tennis Aces of these 3 was the best of them, but Golf apparently supposedly got a lot more content a year later, but the courses that it came with were probably the worst that they've ever been in the Mario Golf canon. And the new courses range from only 9 holes, and some of them were 18 holes, but you know, they were like half-size courses. One of them was New Donk City, and I get that, but and in the case of golf, a lot of bad ideas, like the rush mode looks stupid. It's just a lot of cooling down from getting a little speed boost, and then you collect some coins, and then you get another one. Unless you get run over by somebody, then you lose those coins or whatever. But it doesn't make any sense, though, because you're essentially playing a basic platforming game in a game that whose golf courses aren't designed for platforming. So, and then Mario Strikers, I've talked about that a lot already, but to those who say, well, actually it's faster selling than Charged was, it's like, oh great, the maximum amount of people got to be disappointed so that sub franchise could be poisoned for not forever, but you know, for a very long time. So you're not going to get another one. You might as well not have gotten this one. That game is the caliber of Mario Tennis Ultra Smash, if you think about it. It has no single player content, and you have a basic online, and there's no real options. It has this silly gear system, which is just a bad replacement for just having more characters. I don't want to talk about that game. Anybody who defends that game, just whatever. Not worth having a conversation about it. Yeah, moving on. Talked about Mario Odyssey. It's a game that has a lot of effort put into it, but it's just so easy to play that I think it's the worst mainline Mario game in ever. A lot of people won't see it that way, but the game has no challenge and it has no incentives to replay it because there's no memorable content in it. It's just a smattering of mediocrity. And you know, with that game where it's the worst one of its kind, I feel like a lot of games on Switch are the worst that those series have been by small or large margins. Again, this is speculative for a lot of it, but I did play Mario Odyssey. And the sports games, like, is Mario Tennis better than Mario Tennis Open on the 3DS, it's like maybe, but it's not better than the one on the GameCube. It's not necessarily better than the one on the N64, which it's an N64 game, so big whoop if it is, but certainly not better than the GameCube one. Mario Golf is certainly the worst Mario Golf game compared to Toadstool Tour and World Tour. Strikers goes without saying. And then there's Splatoon 2, which apparently with Splatoon 3 they may have finally gotten a better game than the original on the Wii U, but I haven't played it yet. But I certainly know that Splatoon 2 is a cash-in game. Like, there's no amount of work that went into that. I don't want to say no amount. Like, there's nice touches and new things, but I don't know. Not a great game. And then there's Mario plus Rabbids, which has this very endearing human moment at E3, but otherwise I thought it was a pretty okay game and not really a high-profile third-party game at the end of it all. It's pretty good, though. I never finished it, and a lot of people didn't finish it from the sounds of it. The No More Heroes franchise, another example of the worst versions of that series, are on the Switch. Travis Strikes Again is a bad game, strictly speaking, and No More Heroes 3 seems like it brings back elements of the previous games without knowing why they're in there to begin with. Of course, it's the creator of that series doing it, so if anyone would know, he would know. But either way, haven't played it yet, but it sounds like it's a far less interesting experience than the first and even the second game. I will be very surprised if it's better. I will pick it up eventually, but it somehow seems uglier than the first two, even though it has better detail graphics. It makes the more low detail world look even worse, and a lot of stuff is strictly optional when the fact that it was mandatory in the other games made it important. And No More Heroes just on the Switch seems like a swing and the miss in a lot of ways. Octopath Traveler, the second game, apparently seems to have been much better than the first game. And then there's also all those HD 2D games in addition to the second game. But the first Octopath Traveler was promising that it was the next Final Fantasy 6/3. It was posturing itself like that. And it doesn't sound like the worst game, but it does sound like a disappointment in that the story is not very memorable and the game's a slog, and it's just kind of a disappointment in a lot of ways. And it's definitely not the inheritor of Final Fantasy 3. Smash Ultimate is a good game, even a great game, despite the fact that I don't like it at all, but the graphics in that game are not very good. There's more detail, but there's not enough detail for that washed out lighting that makes half the characters look plasticky, and then there's characters that look straight up bad, like Donkey Kong. And sticking with that, just a lot of games on Switch look not very good. Fire Emblem Three Houses is a terrible looking game. It looks like the world and the environments look like they came from the 3DS and were up-resed. And then Engage looks better graphically, but aesthetically, stylistically, it looks worse with the really weeboo looking characters, which, the point of Fire Emblem, the original aesthetic was somebody with Japanese sensibilities recreating Western fantasy. That's what makes Fire Emblem cool in a lot of ways. So to have it be an anime game stripped down to that is just whatever. Of the Fire Emblem games, I'll probably pick up Engage because apparently the gameplay is pretty good. It's a return to form. Three Houses, I'm a big Fire Emblem fan, a Fire Emblem head, a Fire Emblem freak, but I don't see any reason to pick it up. It has worse map design and a lot of piddling around in this dating / social sim, which, It's not the end of the world if that stuff is in there and it's good, but it's not what I'm looking for. And the things that are pushed aside for it are worse for it now. So, Fire Emblem, as I was saying, like the worst iterations of these games are on the Switch. I think Fire Emblem is at its low point. The only time I could think it was much lower was on the NES, maybe. I could say that was at a lower point with the Wii because there's only one game, but there's also Shadow Dragon. Yeah, it's like Radiant Dawn and Shadow Dragon. Well, Radiant Dawn's considered one of the best games ever by the hardcore fan. There's a reason why people who are core fans of games don't like these series becoming popular all of a sudden. They are hostile to the newcomers because they are afraid that they're going to get displaced, which is a meritable concern. Because I look at something like Engage and Three Houses, and I see people, the core fan base, not that they own the series, so that they don't have any right over it, but they are getting displaced. And I say that as a newer Fire Emblem fan, but I understand why the old fans like old Fire Emblem, and I like it too. And the Switch games, there's something about them. Haven't played either of them. I will play Engage probably, but with Three Houses, that is such an ugly looking game. And the fact that in the reviews nobody seemed to bring that up means that people are either dishonest with people around them or dishonest with themselves. The Switch, for an underpowered console that Nintendo has been working on that kind of level for a while, you think they could make really good looking games for that hardware despite its limitations, but they really haven't, because even, as I said, Metroid Dread, I don't think it's that good looking. All the Pokemon games are horrible in terms of their visuals. Let's face it, the best one being Arceus or maybe Pokemon Let's Go, which none of those games are impressive by any means. So that's the top of the list. And then at the bottom you have Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, or however the monikers go. But those games look like the Secret of Mana remake. Those games are awful looking. And they're being sold for $80. And nobody cares because they buy 20 million of them. But the Switch, for how underpowered it is, it's not like the Game Boy where it was punching up in a lot of cases. Luigi's Mansion 3, which is not a game I'm interested in because it reminds me of Dark Moon, and that both of them are actively missing the point of Luigi's Mansion, and that it's a game about strong atmosphere. Neither of those games have strong atmosphere, so they might be all right games, but they're not carrying on the torch that was the original one. But at the very least, Luigi's Mansion 3 actually looks like a good game, a good looking game. A great looking game, and so does Metroid Prime and Mario Odyssey and Breath of the Wild. Those are good looking games, but a lot of games on the Switch just aren't. And then there's WarioWare, which I'm neither here nor there on that game. It's nice that they went a different direction, but at the same time, like, the direction they went may make everything feel kind of the same because you're interacting with everything the same way. But I don't know anything about the game. Bayonetta 3 seems like a game that, for how long it took to develop, people don't seem that taken with it. Some people don't anyway. This is just the initial hype phase of it. It might be a great game, but it demonstrates that the Switch isn't powerful enough to impress people with games with more detail too. For a game that was such a long wait, it seems like the worst of the series, potentially. Animal Crossing New Horizons, it has different strengths than New Leaf, but New Leaf is a better game than it in certain ways. So Animal Crossing New Horizons, it's hard to say if it's the definitive Animal Crossing, despite the fact that the Switch is the most popular version of it. And again, that doesn't mean anything, but New Leaf had better writing and better music, which a lot of Animal Crossing is about that. So I don't care about New Horizons, but there's obvious weaknesses that they should have accounted for, so that even if the game was not as good in this regard, it wouldn't be outright naked in these shortcomings. Then you have Link's Awakening, which, like with Animal Crossing, I don't think this is the definitive version of Link's Awakening. I think DX is still the definitive version because the art style is too alienating to a subsection of people, for one. And the art style that they went with, as demonstrated by other people, they didn't even fully commit to the tilt-shift camera look of a small toy-like diorama. They just went with some lazy effect on the bottom of the screen, which doesn't translate into the limited focus of a camera on that scale. So the art style, which is questionable, isn't even done that well. And some other issues aside, which are kind of small, I don't think that the quality of life changes in Link's Awakening make the game better to play so much as they make the old game worse to play for someone like me. I was just playing Oracle of Seasons, which has a similar thing with Link's Awakening, in which you only have 2 buttons, but I didn't notice it. I can get over these things, so I don't see a lot of value in adding buttons other than, well, you can do it because the controller has more buttons, so you should do it. But that to me it's more like gentrification, gamer gentrification, than real innovation. All it is doing is making it hard to go back to the old thing, not making the new thing really that much more enjoyable. Obviously, the new thing is slightly more enjoyable, granted, but it's more about the fact that you can't go backwards now. So Link's Awakening on the Switch, I'll eventually get it. I love that game. That game is so cool. That game is timeless, I think, in its design. Fantastic game. And so for that reason, I know that the remake's going to be still enjoyable, but it's not terribly ironclad. And again, like, it's for a game that is on the Switch, it's not definitively better, and it costs 15 times more than it did on the 3DS for an experience that will be a lateral, if not downward, a move. And then there's Nintendo Switch Sports and the rest of the casual lineup, which, aside from Labo to some degree, though not commercially, Labo and Ring Fitness, and maybe Clubhouse Games, which I highly doubt that. Clubhouse Games looks like a collection of virtual board games. I have the one on the DS, so I can't really find any reason to be excited about that. But neither here nor there on that. But really, Ring Fit Adventure and Labo, to some degree, are the only casual games that they've done that are any good. Obviously, Nintendo Switch Sports is a budget game, but still too expensive, and it's a wasted opportunity, seeing as it's just a rehash of sports they've already done, for the most part, with a worse aesthetic and location. They brought back swords and golf and bowling and tennis, and they added some new things. But the new things that they added are versions of tennis in that they're just other rally sports, and I don't think motion controls can actually capture the differences between these different rally sports, such as between badminton and tennis. And everybody, or most people, said that volleyball wasn't any good. Like, it's just simplistic. So Nintendo Switch Sports, rather, even at its price compared to the free pack-in that was Wii Sports, and compared to even Wii Play Motion, and especially compared to Wii Sports Resort and Nintendo Land, there's no comparison. It's a lame game that they couldn't even get golf out at launch, and it took months and months for them to add golf. And it's doing so well because people will just buy anything if it's on Switch. But one of the worst versions of a game in its respective series. And then you have Labo, which is a mixed bag, with probably the vehicle Toy-Con being the best, and then followed by the VR stuff. And then by extension, you got Game Maker's Garage, which may or may not be good. I don't know. It's not my kind of game, but that doesn't mean it's not meritable. And other casual titles. 1-2 Switch was hot garbage. And Labo was overpriced. And so it was ultimately a failure because they just didn't support a really great idea with meaningful software. So it's a mixed bag on the whole. Their casual lineup on the Switch has been pretty pitiful overall. And I don't see how anybody could argue with me on that. Like, Wii Sports Resort and Nintendo Land. Think of what juggernauts those games were. And Wii Party and Wii Party U and Wii Fit. People make fun of the casual lineup on the Wii, but that had some muscle behind it. This is a lot of toe dipping. Anyway, the Switch isn't the worst console that I've ever played. Not even the worst Nintendo console. But I'd rather be reliving the Wii U and 3DS era. Because when you think about it, like, whatever people's issues with the Wii U, some good games came out on it in their time. Honestly, almost a comparable amount to what came out on Switch. Thing was only out for 4 years. The Switch has been out for 6. And then, if there wasn't something great happening on the Wii U, then there's something great happening on the 3DS. Of course, I'm going to play all these games and my opinion might change. And this is all speculative, despite how inflammatory it is. But I'm not excited for anything too much. Pikmin 4 looks great, but due to the configuration of the game, I think that Pikmin 3 will be a better game. Though Pikmin 3 is wonderful, so if it's not as good as Pikmin 3, I'm not going to hold that against Pikmin 4. And there's enough games, maybe about 60, that are worth having on the Switch, but considering the number of games that I've accrued for the other Nintendo consoles and the quality of those games, it's not that impressive. I'll find out for myself. I don't think I'm going to be wowed, though. That being said, I'm going to be getting a new computer, and you might see me play Metroid Prime Remastered. I'll live stream it or whatever. And, you'll see me having a grand time, and that might be the start of a nice positive upswing. But I've never understood the fervor behind the Switch, other than the fact that it's a very great, marketable idea that comes at the cost of many sacrifices in the hardware and by extension into the software. And the software doesn't even live up to a low bar that it sets, a low baseline. That's how I feel about the Switch right now. But I own one. One thing I do like about the Switch is there are certain SNES titles that are hard to obtain that are much more affordable on the Switch. And that's something to be happy about, certainly. So that will conclude this episode. If you have any questions or comments, grievances you'd like to air out, by all means, send them to nalistenerq@gmail.com. That is nalistenerq@gmail.com. As I mentioned before, I have a YouTube channel that I am planning to create content for. I already have some content up there, but I need a good computer to create content. So no content is being created at this time, but in a couple weeks' time here, you might see me do Let's Plays and talk on the camera. And I actually think that could be kind of enjoyable because of the trouble I have with games, that the only way I can progress through them is perseverance. That might be funny to behold. But that's in the future. But if you want to support the YouTube channel, it's Nintendo Deep Dive. That's the name of the channel. The logo is the same as my podcast logo. And yeah, that's what you have to look forward to in the future. In the meantime, though, hope you enjoyed listening, and God bless.